Thank you, Kavi. The last point you made is about Australia perhaps not treating regarding ASEAN as ASEAN, but as a sort of bilateral relationships and then focusing on domestic situations in the different ASEAN countries. I want to pose a question for Kavi to address when you speak next, and then I'll open up the floor. You have talked about ASEAN as a monolithic whole, kind of ASEAN, but in fact ASEAN has many and growing internal challenges now. The domestic politics in the ASEAN countries, there are some challenges. Even Indonesia, certainly Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, and then the other countries, especially Myanmar. So perhaps when you speak next, you can address, how do the domestic political challenges impact ASEAN community aspirations and other cooperation schemes. Now the floor is open. We'll take not too long, but I'm an employee of the university. I need to encourage you to go and see the Red Cross Fair. But we will take some time for questions or comments from the floor. The floor is open.
Thank you, Dr. Thitinan. Dr. Wilfred Herman, HDFF. Thank you for the panelists for the very good presentations, and I really enjoyed the deep inside view of Australian ASEAN relations. I have one understanding question to Umesh and a longer question to John. Umesh, did I really catch that you said we will have in the next 10 to 15 years 3-point-something billion middle-class people? Does it mean our pro-poor policies are all coming out and bringing people out of the poverty? Just as a question part. To John, a little bit coming up on that what Gwen said, and especially Kavi. Key point, I think, for the security concerns is the South China Sea. And my question is, can the actual close relation between Australia and Japan's turn to collective self-defense, and the support for some claimants with weapon systems, with trainings, maybe motivate Australia to take a more active role? I'm not talking about Japanese-made submarines, okay? But can this be true, or will it be blocked because security still is not emancipated from the economy? So security has to step back if economical gains are expected. Thank you.
That I have gone through suggests that the middle class, now it depends on how you define middle class, will rise to about 3.2 billion people across Asia. Not ASEAN. ASEAN would not have that. Obviously, a big chunk of it would come from China and India. India today has about 500 million people, 400 something to 500 million people. China, about, I think, more than that. But as of today, supposedly, according to what, if you believe statistics from the ASEAN Secretariat and other places, the middle class stands at 1.32 billion in Asia alone. So it'll basically double, slightly more than double, over the next 15, 20 years. So I guess that's all I can answer, because I'm not a policymaker here. Sorry.
I think a couple of points I'd make is that, and a colleague of mine at University of Australian National University, Hugh White, he's really hard on this issue of economics and security being linked. He's argued that in a couple of articles he's written lately that Australia should be afraid that if we are seen to be too close to Japan, that Australia's trade with China will suffer. I don't buy it. China doesn't trade with Australia because it likes Australia. It trades with us because it's a good deal. That's why. And it needs what we've got. And we've got a lot of it. Yes, there are niche areas where China can play a card, if you like it's alleged it did against Japan with rare earth exports. But there are knock-on consequences of that. And Japan is already looking elsewhere, and there's a whole raft of knock-on consequences from that kind of aggressive behaviour that China doesn't want to have impact on its own economic development. And I think there's a parallel here with what's happened with Russia and Europe following its stoush in the Ukraine. The Europeans are now looking furiously to find alternative sources of gas and energy to reduce their reliance on Russian gas and energy, because they're capricious and people don't want to, they don't trust that Russia will not turn the taps off in the middle of winter. Likewise, the Japanese are very worried that China's going to try and pull this stunt again next time there's a spat over something. And I think China understands that. I think they know that they can play that game once or twice, but then the knock-on consequences may be greater than the benefits of pulling that. And certainly, the Australian, my read of Australian politics is that both sides of politics in Australia get that China has a vested interest, as does Australia, in keeping the equation separate. There's economics, and it's boom time, and then there's security. And Australia, to be fair, has been working quite hard to get China to play in security space. And one of the things that came out of the loss of the MH370 Malaysian Airlines plane was that China wanted to participate in the aerial surveillance over the southern Indian Ocean. Now, we've been trying to get China to play in Air Force to Air Force collaboration for quite some time, but China was not remotely interested. All of a sudden, they're interested. So, hey, great, let's play, let's cooperate. Now, the point I made at the time was, look, wouldn't it have been great if we'd planned this before? Because conducting joint surveillance operations 1,000 miles off the coast of Australia in the southern Indian Ocean is bloody dangerous. It's the kind of activity you want to have rehearsed. That's the whole point of military exercises. You rehearse to reduce risk of accidents and of things going wrong. Now, as it turns out, it worked out okay. But hopefully, the door will open, much like after the Indian Ocean tsunami, when cooperation on HADR matters emerged, that we'll see greater cooperation between the maritime states that have an interest in maritime surveillance, maritime security, patrols, that we might actually see that happen. So, so that's partly the answer. On the question of Japan, and I've got a piece, I think it's coming out in the next day or so with East Asia Forum, on Japan being a normal country and the consequences in Southeast Asia. Japan is its own worst enemy sometimes, unfortunately. The stuff it's been coming out with about the comfort women, I mean, please, what are you trying to do? You're really making it hard. But Japan is a liberal, open democracy. It's actually a thriving country. It's got its problems, it's got a declining population, it's got a whole raft of issues. But, in terms of a constructive engager with Southeast Asia, with Australia, Japan's really up there. It's really a good news story, except they go and spike it with this, this stuff that's clearly for domestic Japanese political audiences. It's a problem, but it's not an insurmountable problem. But it is a perception problem for them. Japan is a normal country. I don't think it's unreasonable that they become normal in terms of security space. They are, after all, the 8th largest defence spender in the world. They have a very, very capable defence force. It's a kick-ass defence force. And when it's freed up to do things, like, what it did in the Philippines after the typhoon, they can really do some good stuff. They've been constrained by, a constitution that's arguably a bit of an anachronism. that's a debatable point. I'm happy to take that. That's not set in stone. That it's not. But China is. It's interesting. You know, I've just read Professor Stuart Harris's great book on China's foreign policy, and it's a really nice counterpoint to Hugh White's argument about China. Hugh paints this picture of a black and white belligerent China, you know, that we have to kowtow to try and placate and make some space, because otherwise it's World War III. He doesn't quite use those words. That's my paraphrase, okay? So please don't quote me back to Hugh. I respect Hugh immensely. He has actually made a very significant contribution to get us thinking and talking about so what, the so what of the rise of China. It's very important. I happen to disagree with his conclusions. But Stuart Harris, former diplomat, professor at ANU, studied China. He's actually got it's a good read, I can recommend it, China's Foreign Policy. He makes the point that, you know, China is actually not a country that's focused on being belligerent. It's got legitimate interests, it's got legitimate contestable claims, the legitimacy of which is contestable, but they are out there, and it is pursuing its interests in what, you know, in terms of great power dynamics, is not unreasonable. It's not unreasonable. My point about Southeast Asia, it's not unreasonable for ASEAN to speak with one voice back. It's not unreasonable. This is what powers do if they think in realpolitik terms about what's in their interests. China is acting in its interests. Not unreasonable. Completely get it. Australia should act in its interests, so should Thailand, and I think, and that's part of my point, I see Thailand's interests as intimately connected to ASEAN's interests. So turning a blind eye to what's happening in the South China Sea, I do not see as being in Thailand's interests. It may appear so in the short term, but in the long run, it's completely corrosive to ASEAN, completely toxic to ASEAN. So I've had enough. Thanks.
Okay. I think Thailand has played very important roles in getting ASEAN together in negotiating COC with China. You have to give Thailand credit, because as a non-claimant, Thailand has done a good job in a very short time. Even though a lot of people think that China will buy time, I don't think so, because if China delay, it will have to pay certain price. At the moment, there's still over 300 some days that Thailand will serve as a coordinator, because the next coordinator will be a different ball game. So China need to utilize this. And I like the point you made that ASEAN has to speak with one voice. And then that is not necessarily the case all the time. I've tried to link to Ajahn Thitinan's point. ASEAN has many persona. On certain issue, they can speak with one voice. Even on the most divided issue like South China Sea, I will give you one example. During the first 6 months of this year, ASEAN come out with 2 statements on South China Sea. The first one on the on what happens with the Philippines. The second one, it was happened without mentioning Vietnam, which including the Paracel, which has indeed engaged ASEAN in a broader South China Sea conflict. Before that, ASEAN refused to recognize Paracel, thinking that is Vietnam and the ASEAN issue. So in that sense, ASEAN has been very united against China border. Of course, if you look back to 2012, then ASEAN was divided. So I must say that on certain issue at certain time, ASEAN unity increased, especially when it's under pressure, especially when it's near summit time. So ASEAN wanted to show off the leaders' determinations to fight against external pressure. I think that should be put into consideration, even though sometimes ASEAN could not speak with one voice, because as you point out, ASEAN has many different stages of economic developments, political culture, and now, especially with China, with very uneven relation. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, let me just add a point on the domestic politics and the question. Does it also have to do with the fact that Prime Minister Hun Sen's CPP lost some electoral support in July 2013 because his domestic standing is weaker? And is it also partly because of Myanmar's domestic situation where the regime is in a weaker position?
Well, that's one way to describe. But I look at the whole fiasco in 2012 as the era of Ho Nam Hong, who disconnected with the rest of ASEAN. And Hun Sen was caught in a huge dilemma because he was the man who taught him diplomacy when he was young and inexperienced. So he could not do anything until today. So I think that is one of the most important. Secondly, I don't think Hun Sen acquiesced with Ho Nam Hong action at all. Why? If you go to Phnom Penh now, there's a lot of talk that Hun Sen now is much more friendly to Japan and realize that it needs support of Japan. So number three, it's also China relation with Cambodia that must consider, because it's only in the past decade that China has played the most significant role in provide quick financial assistance to Cambodia, which Hun Sen won, because Hun Sen was fed up with consortium of assistance from all this country, 21 countries who impose all kinds of conditions. So Hun Sen said that we can get everything from China. Now with China comprise over 60% of foreign assistance, Cambodia can move on and achieve the economic developments as one of the young tiger in the past year. But it will not be long lasting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the ASEAN states are hedging in different ways. I think, Gwen, do you want to contribute something?
Thanks, Ajahn. I just wanted to say, picking up on Kavi's point, and also mentions today and also in many discussions about ASEAN, this point about ASEAN unity or disunity, I think is in some ways a little misplaced. So what if, I mean, there has to be some acknowledgement how radically different, not just stages of development, but geopolitical considerations are within the ASEAN member community. But and a good example is to look at the EU and the extraordinary, how Europe has even managed to get, I mean, people can laugh about the EU, but actually, you know, when in very critical times they managed to form kind of a common voice or at least reach a common agreement, but still have a variety of voices through mechanisms, including NATO and other things. And perhaps one point here with ASEAN is particularly on the security front, but also on economic front, but their mechanisms are not fully matured, and I think particularly on the security front, RCEP and for whatever it used to be and various other things they've set up are not really at the point where they can have this kind of allowance of different views and yet reach a common point that provides some kind of unity when it's important, but to allow for these geographic strategic realities of how different they are. So that would just be my point, that expectations should not be too strong, that, you know, you need them to speak with a united voice. They will never be united totally because their geographic considerations are too different. That's all I'd like to say.
Okay, thank you, Gwen.
Chai Sanjinda, I'm an independent specialist. You know, if you're a tennis fan, there was a big hoo-ha on the Wimbledon courts 2 weeks ago when the Australian player Nick Kyrgios, who was unheralded at that time, defeated number one, Nadal. Now, the thing is, I brought this up is because his mother is Malaysian. Okay, you were talking about DNA earlier. You have to find somebody in Australia which has some ASEAN-related DNA. Okay, so what better way if you can give him some sort of role, as some sort of like a goodwill ambassador, if you like, back in the 1970s, how did China-U.S. relations start? Wasn't it through ping-pong diplomacy? So maybe now Australia can think about tennis diplomacy by sending Nikkei girls around and give some tennis clinics here and there. I mean, for one, I'm sure he'll be welcome in Malaysia because his mother is from there. So I'm sure all the other parts of Southeast Asia would similarly give him a hearty and a warm welcome. And I think I say this is because then you can start linking and connecting and relating to ASEAN a little bit more closely through the people-people connectivity. And I'm sure that would earn Australia many brownie points and would put Australia on top of the world down under. Thank you.
My name is Maya from Southeast Asian Studies, Chulalongkorn University. This is a very great pleasure to have all experts here. And I just want to ask very quick questions since we have a lot of experts. I'm Indonesian student studying in Thailand, and we bring our community here just to ask, how do you perceive Indonesian election actually? Because in ASEAN-Australia relation in Asia transformation, I think Indonesia new political configuration will also impact or affect the ASEAN-Australia relation nowadays. And to what extent our elected new president of Indonesia will impact political status and configuration of ASEAN and Australia for special cases. Thank you.
Like Kun Kavi, I think I like what I hear from all the speakers, and just 2 points that I like to stress. ASEAN-Australia relationship is only 7 years younger than ASEAN itself. We basically grew up together. Imagine, when you grew up together with some 7-year-old kid. Australia knows us very well. And I just want to give, despite all the views expressed, I just would like to express a word of encouragement, because everything is timing. You look at ASEAN, we've been around for 74 years. We just start talking about connectivity. We're just talking about we need to know the Cambodian, we need to know the Indonesian. 3-4 years ago only. The master plan on ASEAN connectivity came alive only 4 years ago. So I think now that we talk, Kun Kavi raised a point about Australia ASEAN connectivity. I think it's a good start. I think we should stay the course and maintain the trend, build up the momentum. Talking about geography, I like to add one more continent on your geography, which is Africa. Because we talk all about Japan and all that, and we talk about the role of China, posture a bit aggressive and all that. Look at Japan also, because Japan now has a definite strategy to come through Asia. That's why we talk about Japan presence in Cambodia. Japan has a clear vision on mainland ASEAN, from Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar. And that's why Japan is interested to build this deep sea port in the way. And not to reach India, but to reach Africa. So from there, I think the strategic expert can make his own calculus. I don't know much about those part of the country, but the fight, South China Sea, could be also a distraction. Of course, you see the oil and the gas under the ocean, but I think it's just a distraction. Look at the 22nd century, where China will be, where Japan would be, and maybe things would be clearer to you. Be clearer to Dr. John Blaxland, I think, because he's a strategist. Just like to leave it at that, and I think ASEAN is also in process, as when we are not European Union. It's a process. We have come a long way. For Thailand, ASEAN is #1 market. For many ASEAN countries, ASEAN #1 market. With the connectivity, which will be realized logistically, things even will become even more attractive for others to do business with ASEAN. Just like to comment like that. Thank you.
ASEAN-Australia 2014, ASEAN was very different in 1974. There were just the original 5 members. And prior to that, the cooperation between between Southeast Asia and Australia was confined under SEATO with just Philippines and Thailand. So the ASEAN, the broad and full 10-member ASEAN is a more recent phenomenon that we must not forget. And we've come a long way from 1974. Now, I want to come just to the question by the student here. And I was trying to get to this earlier, so in fact you've done the better job at encapsulating the question. Indonesia domestic politics. Indonesia is the locomotive of ASEAN. It has been, always been, and will be. And it has the election now, who takes over. In the last 10 years, it's done very well. It has led ASEAN, especially when Thailand has had some domestic difficulties. Indonesia's role was critical. But now, what do we expect? What can we expect? I mean, under Marty, President Yudhoyono, I think they did a fantastic job. I think domestically, a lot of criticisms, indecisive. We tend to do that, very critical at home. But from outside, Indonesia has fulfilled a leadership role for ASEAN. Indonesia is in the G20, and without Indonesia in the last 5 years in particular, ASEAN would not have done as well. But now Indonesia has a contentious election. I don't know if the loser will accept, and that's really the key, whether the loser will concede. And it looks like the winner is fairly clear, but the margin perhaps is still close, too close. So on a number of fronts, I mean, Indonesia is a leading democracy in the region. If its democracy becomes problematic, it's not a great momentum for democratization in Southeast Asia in view of problems that we've seen around the neighborhood. And then its role in ASEAN, G20 and so on, if Indonesia is not going to have a government till late in the year. So the next few months, there's no thrust in ASEAN, behind ASEAN. So what can we, anyone you want to answer this in particular? I'll come to Kun Kavi first, and then anyone else can add as they like.
Okay. Indonesia has been very successful since 1988. Indonesia used to be the lowest denominator. Nothing within ASEAN could move ahead without Indonesia green light. And now Indonesia played a very important role since 2003, drafting main force in ASEAN charters and design all these political and security cooperation. And I believe that this election, despite all these ambiguities, uncertainty, Indonesia democracy will prevail because Indonesia has come very, very far. And I think hopefully Prabowo will accept. I'm assuming that Jokowi Widodo will win. Maybe in this case, I believe the quick count conducted by CSIS, because I know the guy who conducted. They are very accurate, and I think if Indonesia pass this test, it will become, and Indonesia will proudly announce that it's become the mature democracy and the world's third largest democracy. That will be a big boost for ASEAN. And I think ASEAN need that. But there is one caveat. Indonesia that is so advanced, so big, G20, sometimes can cause trouble because in the earlier years, we want to contain Indonesia, and now Indonesia has become a big giant and it has a lot of say. So, the recent, early this year, over the Harun's incident is a good indicator that sometimes insensitivities over some historical issues, can cause trouble. This is not about Thailand and Cambodia, but it's about Indonesia with Singapore. So I think I still have confidence that Indonesia democracy will prevail. Certainly the court or whatever the challenge is will be decided within the next 3 months. I don't think Indonesian politics has the kind of longevities like Thailand. You can be 1 year like without governments, like in Cambodia or in Thailand, political uncertainties for 6 months. I think Indonesia probably will have until the next few weeks to sort things out. So we have to wait.
Okay, thank you. Do we a quick word comment from Gwen Robinson, and we'll wrap up as the last word from Dr. John Blaxland.
Well, just a couple of very quick points, and we still clearly we still can't confirm what way Indonesia's really going to go until July 22nd at the latest, as you know. And they're two entirely different paths, I think, depending on who does win. But if, as Kavi and most people think, Jokowi will be the winner, again, as I said before, I think it feeds into this same theme of renewal and on a number of fronts. It could be a great moment for Australia also to, recalibrate its relationship and have a new era and put Indonesia, its most important regional relationship, on a new and better footing. But also for ASEAN itself to reformulate or revitalise the role of Indonesia within ASEAN. And Indonesia has been very turned in on itself and preoccupied with its own domestic politics in the last year. So, there are multiple chances out of this election. I think it's an extremely important moment. And if, as the unforeseeable happens and there is a Prabowo win, well, that again, it's still a new era. So there's a lot of thinking that has to go into this, not just for Australia, but also the region, and also, of course, Thailand, each of the ASEAN member states, which have in the past looked towards Indonesia for leadership. So, very important moment, I'd say.
From our side, from here in Bangkok, what seems critical now is these institutional backstops. At the end, anywhere when you have contentious politics, it has to stop somewhere. So there has to be some kind of final arbitration, I think, that will end up with the constitutional court in Indonesia. And it has to be accepted. So the institutional backstops have to be credible and acceptable enough. Otherwise, you can exercise a veto on the system. And hopefully we will not see that in Indonesia's case. Last word from you, Dr. John Blaxland.
Thanks, Dr. Thitinan. Thank you. Terima kasih, Maya, for the question. It's a good question, and it's a one that deeply concerns Australians because the outcome has significant ramifications for bilateral relations and regional relations. Prabowo is an ex-Kopassus commander, and he is symbolic of an old era, if you like, an era of Suhartoist rule. He's aligned, he's son-in-law of Suharto, and then you've got Jokowi, who's aligned with Sukarno Megawati Sukarno Putri, the Sukarno clan. It's like the two families are competing. But from Australia's point of view, one of the concerns I have is that Prabowo has been talking about winding back democracy and of undoing an open society, and that is deeply disconcerting. And it's disconcerting not just because we care about what happens in Indonesia, but the ramifications for the bilateral relationship are not good. And they're not good because Australia is a very open society, and it's got some very strong libertarian impulses. And human rights and civil liberties and protection of that, I grant you that there's a lot of contention over the refugee crisis, but I think that's in most Australian people's minds it's kind of contained. In terms of broader civil liberties concerned, Australians are upset about one of the real rub points and concerns in the future is the fear in many Indonesians' minds is that there may well be a repeat of East Timor in West Papua. Now, West Papua is a completely different legal, international set of circumstances to East Timor. East Timor was always contested. West Papua is not legally contested in the UN. It's just in a different league entirely. But the fear is there in Indonesia. They feel it palpably. This, you Australians, you did it to us in East Timor, you're going to do it again in West Papua. And every policymaker in Canberra says, no, we'll never do that. But you know what? Australia is a democracy. And in a democracy, in a liberal Western democracy, if enough people get upset, the government has to listen. And that is a real challenge. So if we find ourselves in a predicament where Indonesia goes down a hardline anti-democratic path that abuses human rights, that tries to bury mistakes, it will make the relationship much more tricky, much more difficult, and it will therefore make the relationship with ASEAN that much more complicated. So, touch wood, you know. Jokowi is an interesting case because he really does seem to augur a period of openness and fresh perspective, which is, so who knows. Ambassador Pibonsonggram, thank you for the very kind remarks. Can I just say one thing about the South China Sea being a distraction? I take your point about Africa, and I think the map I put up actually had Africa on it. But most of the trade is up to around the Horn of Africa. So it's not that much down the east coast of Africa. And that's from statistical analysis. But I take your point. But on whether or not the South China Sea fight is a distraction, you know, I maybe on one level, and I think you may well be right that there's certainly more to what China is doing. China is investing very heavily across Asia, across Africa. That's one of the reasons why India is worried about so much Chinese traffic passing through the Indian Ocean. Why? Because China is reliant on trade from Africa and the Middle East, and they're invested very heavily there. Quite reasonably. I mean, these are rational economic decisions that China's making for its own national interests. Perfectly reasonable. It's perceptions. It's the ramification of perceptions of what that might mean, and the fear of the string of pearls that India's talked about. You know, that they might be surrounded by Chinese naval bases. I don't see that as a real concern. But I do think the South China Sea is particularly interesting, and the East China Sea, because the United States is being tested by China. The United States is the treaty ally of the Philippines, it's a treaty ally of Japan, and on Senkaku or Diaoyu, depending on whose side you take, what the islands are called in the East China Sea, the United States has given a guarantee over Senkaku, or the Japanese call Senkaku Islands. That's big. That means that they're contested islands. I mean, we know that if they went to the ICJ, it's a toss of a coin as to whether China would win or Japan would win. I'm not certain. I suspect it wouldn't be the way Japan likes. Don't know. I'm not a lawyer. But my sense is the way ICJ tends to go is that it could go against Japan, which is why they don't want to go there, right? So they're trying to avoid the ICJ. But the American guarantee, it's understandable, and it's what we've seen is the quid pro quo for the American guarantee of Senkaku is Abe saying, righto, I will change the clause, I will change the way we can now become a normal country. That's a brave step politically, domestically politically, for him to do, because there's not the numbers in there for him politically, domestically, to go down the path. But he's chosen to do it, and I would argue it's a quid pro quo for Obama's guarantee over Senkaku. But in the South China Sea, it's very tricky because we have the situation where the United States is bolstering its ties with the Philippines. The Philippines has not helped itself. It's not spent a brass razoo on any consequential military capability since 1989, when the Americans pulled out of Subic Bay and Clark Airfield, right? So they now are looking to the US to do their dirty work for them. The United States is not going to do it. It's just not going to do it because it's not in their interest. But that leaves them in a conundrum, because around the region, it looks like America's not ponying up, not really got the mettle. And that's exactly what China wants.
Thank you very much. Look, we've learned a lot today about Australia, internal politics of Australia, internal politics, dynamics of ASEAN individual states of ASEAN, including particularly Indonesia, and also, of course, ASEAN-Australia relations after 40 years. There are many more years to go, so we intend to have a conference like this at the 45th and at the 50th. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking the speakers for making the time and effort for excellent remarks today. Thank you very much. And I thank the Australian Embassy and Ambassador James Wise again for co-hosting, sponsoring this forum. Our next event will be next Wednesday, on the macroeconomic impact of the military intervention, Wednesday, July 23rd. Thank you very much for joining us.